The following series is meant as pure fan fiction, and in no way does it share the views of anyone else or those involved in this story. This page will explore the possibilities of Kurt Cobain's life had he not taken his own life on April 5th, 1994. We will start with a recap of the events that took place between March and April of 1994. Everything that happened in that time frame in our timeline happens in this timeline as well. We will start with a quick recap of the events taking place between March and April of 1994. March 1st, 1994. The March 1st Munich show was held in a World War II-era airplane hangar that was now being used as a concert venue. Not much remodeling had been done to the facility. It was cold and damp and had acoustics that were horrid for a band with boomy sound like Nirvana. Kurt hated the look of this place, and cursed the fact that his career had progressed to the point where Nirvana were playing airplane hangars. Though part of the reason for this was their huge fan base, which was too loud and rowdy for most European opera house venues. Kurt had personally asked his childhood heroes, the Melvins, to open these European dates, and when their set was over, Kurt went to lead singer Buzz Osborne's dressing room where he announced that he was ending the band, his marriage, his relationship with the managers, and perhaps his whole concept of being in a band. "I should just be doing this solo," he told Osborne. In retrospect, Osborne said he was talking about his entire life. Pat Smear later recalled that Kurt's voice was indeed completely shot by the Munich show. Kurt and I were suffering from bronchitis, and his voice had become noticeably more trashed with every song, Smear told the journalists. When we sang together, we sounded like cats fighting. His voice was so gone, but instead of trying to conserve it, he seemed to delight in pushing it to the "I won't be able to sing for days" limit. After a while, it was a bit much. To Novoselic and Grohl, who had been on the road with Kurt for more years than Smear, it was obvious that if the band was going to self-destruct, it would be Kurt's doing. As Kurt walked off stage, he went directly to his agent, who had flown in to make sure the show went off without any problems. "That's it. Cancel the next gig," Kurt said without emotion as he walked to his dressing room. No explanation was given, and none was needed. Kurt had been threatening to cancel the tour even before it began, and for the entire month everyone in the crew had imagined each show might be the last. Novoselic, who knew Kurt better than anyone, had sensed for months that Kurt's interest in leading Nirvana had passed. The band was over, Novoselic later recalled. On March 1st, 1994, the only thing that officially ended was this single leg of the In Utero European tour. But everyone knew that a larger story was coming to a close. Finally, in a drafty, abandoned airplane hangar in Munich, in circumstances almost as dreary as their genesis, Nirvana had ended. Chris and Dave had flown home to be with their families at this time. Kurt and Pat ended up going to meet Courtney Love in Rome. Later in Rome, Kurt had overdosed by taking Rohypnol and mixing it with champagne. He was rushed to a hospital and did not die, though several news reports announced that he had. Novoselic was back in Seattle and got a phone call from management saying Kurt was dead, as did Grohl. CNN ran a news flash on Cobain's death, as did a wire service news bulletin. Kurt came out of the coma that afternoon and was back in Seattle 2 days later. He spent much of the next month on a heroin binge. His usage was so reckless that even his drug buddies began to shun him, worried that he might die in their presence. Following Cobain's overdose in Rome and domestic dispute calls in which he had firearms confiscated, in March 1994, Love, along with several of his friends and bandmates, enlisted the help of an intervention counselor. "They called me to see what could be done," he explained to Rolling Stone. He was using, up in Seattle. He was in full denial. It was very chaotic. And they were in fear for his life. It was a crisis. In late March, Love, Novoselic, and Pat Smear, along with several other friends, went through staging an intervention at Cobain's home. During the meeting, Love reportedly threatened to leave Cobain, with whom she shared daughter Frances Bean, and his band also issued an ultimatum of breaking up the band should he not agree to seek treatment at a rehabilitation facility. Kurt was displeased with the entire thing, and especially angry at Chris Novoselic for how he spoke to him. Kurt and Pat retreated to the basement to work on some material, and Pat told Kurt he should just try the rehab. Several days later, Cobain would do just that, but first he paid a visit to one of his best friends, Dylan Carlson, who also participated in the intervention. At his Seattle home on March 30th, citing problems with trespassers on his property, Cobain asked for help securing a firearm. Cobain gave him about $300 to buy a 20-gauge shotgun and a box of ammunition from Stan's gun shop. Knowing that Cobain was about to depart for treatment near Los Angeles, Carlson said that his friend's need for the purchase did give him pause. It seemed kind of weird that he was buying the shotgun before he was leaving, so I offered to hold on to it until he got back. Cobain, however, insisted on keeping the weapon himself, and, according to police, he likely dropped off the gun at his home before traveling to the Exodus Recovery Center in Marina Del Rey, California, later that day. Courtney was hoping to coax Kurt into going to rehab with her, but she ended up on a plane to LA at the end of the first day of the intervention. She would later regret leaving Cobain alone. On April 1st, Cobain fell in love with a cryptic message. According to an account, the whole front woman gave a local Seattle newspaper, he said in part, "Just remember, no matter what, I love you." Later that night, after spending just 2 days in rehab, staffers said he alerted them that he was stepping out to smoke a cigarette on the patio. Love explained that's when he allegedly jumped over more than a 6 feet high brick wall and disappeared. April 1994. At this point, we are asked to believe that Kurt went missing, which we know is not the case in our true timeline. On April 3rd, Courtney Love hired private investigator Tom Grant to locate her missing husband after he, quote-unquote, escaped rehab. Kurt flew to Seattle. She had canceled his credit card, so he couldn't do anything. There was a charge for over $1,000 that was declined that day. If that was Cobain, he was boxed in. His car was parked in the garage with his tires slashed. Kurt took a cab to get shotgun shells. Kurt must have had a feeling about what was going on. Chris Novoselic, who had seen Kurt the week prior, stated that Kurt was out of his mind. I think the Rome thing really messed him up. He just wasn't there. Tom Grant flies to Seattle in search for Kurt. The first place he checks is the Lake Washington house, contrary to where Courtney has him take his investigation. She had him check big hotels under fake names. She would say that Kurt would only stay at the finest hotels, Courtney knowing that Kurt would definitely be at the house. Michael Callie DeWitt was the nanny for Frances Bean, and Courtney stated that if Kurt showed up at the house, Callie would call her. Right from the get-go, Tom noticed some inconsistencies in Courtney's overall story about what was going on. She freaked out about Kurt backing out of Lollapalooza and passing up millions of dollars. She's mad that he canceled his tour and now owes millions of dollars. She goes on about Kurt wanting a divorce and how Kurt is cheating on her. Grant begins to tape the conversations he has with Courtney from this point forward. It seemed more about her and her money than it did about her missing husband. She didn't care about Kurt or where Kurt was. At this point, Kurt is worth more dead than he is alive to Courtney Love. Tom begins to believe that hiring him is just as an alibi, to make her look innocent in what seems to be a plot to have her husband killed, with the motive being millions of dollars in revenue and royalties from Kurt Cobain. Because Courtney knows if Kurt divorces her, she doesn't get any of that money. Tom desperately searches for Kurt Cobain at this point. April 5th, 1994. This is where the timeline changes. In the actual timeline, this is the day that Kurt apparently, quote-unquote, takes his own life. The proceedings of our new timeline happens a day earlier. Tom Grant goes to Seattle late afternoon, April 4th. He speaks with Courtney over the phone. He tapes those calls. Tom had a gut feeling, as did his partner, about what was initially said about the whole situation. Tom doesn't meet Courtney in person at the peninsula. Instead, he goes directly to Seattle to save time, as he is working on other cases. He figures whatever Courtney needs to say, they can discuss it over the phone. He records all his phone calls, and that'll make it easier to review the case later. Upon arrival in Seattle late April 4th, around 9 p.m., Tom spoke with Courtney over the phone to discuss further instructions on the case. Courtney begins to tell Tom to start by looking in the best hotels in the city, stating that Kurt only stayed at the best hotels in the city. This proved to be wrong information. It seems as if Courtney was doing anything she could to keep Tom Grant away from the Lake Washington Boulevard home. Why would she do that? It must be obvious that Kurt would go to his house if he was in Seattle, knowing Courtney wouldn't be there. There must be some other motive. Tom would later come to realize this. Around midnight, April 5th, 1994, Tom would make his first stop in his investigation at the Lake Washington house. He figured he would stake the house out overnight in the odd chance Cobain makes an appearance, before starting his investigation throughout the city during the early morning/afternoon of April 5th. It was dark and not much could be seen. There was no motion sensor lights near the home. The gate to the driveway was open, so Tom pulled in. As he pulled in, he didn't notice the garage at first. It was so dark. With an accidental flick of his high beams, he shined light on what he could see was an open garage with a vehicle inside, and a balcony above the door. There must be a room up there, Tom thought to himself. He kept that in mind for later. It was the early morning of April 5th, around 2 a.m. Tom wasn't expecting to see anyone, but he had hope of running into Cobain or maybe even the name, Michael Callie DeWitt. Tom had some questions he wanted to ask if he happened to run into him. Parked in the driveway of Lake Washington home, Grant noticed someone exit the house and walked towards the garage he noticed earlier. It was so dark he couldn't tell who it was, but he thought this might be Cobain. So he waited in the dark until the shadowy figure disappeared around the corner of the back of the garage. It was dark and eerie, but Tom needed to know who this was walking through the driveway at 2 a.m. Tom waited about 10-15 minutes before exiting his vehicle. He was very quiet. The entrance to the greenhouse was hard to find in the dark, but Tom made his way up the staircase behind the garage. As Tom got to the top of the stairs, he could smell cigarettes and marijuana. Looking in, he could see a light set up on the floor with, quote-unquote, just enough light to see what they were doing up there. Tom would later say in a book he wrote about the entire situation. They were just doing drugs up there. I feel like they met there because they had some rule about not doing drugs in the house. Tom knocked on the door to the greenhouse. It scared the hell out of both of them. They thought I was the cops, Tom said. Callie is the one who answered the door. He seemed really sketched out. When he answered the door, Tom introduced himself and told him that he was hired by Courtney Love to find her missing husband. What the fuck are you doing here at like 3 a.m., Callie said to Tom. Tom suggested that Courtney had sent him to stake out the house that morning. Looking stunned and visibly shook by the encounter, Callie agreed to speak with Tom. He kind of held the door open with his foot and came outside briefly. Tom asked if anyone else is in there with him, or if it was just Callie. Callie said it was just him inside the greenhouse. He was, quote-unquote, cleaning up at 2:30 a.m. That doesn't seem suspicious. As Tom was talking to Callie, Kurt can be heard asking who's at the door. At that moment, Tom had realized that Kurt was inside and asked to speak with Kurt. Callie reluctantly agreed to let Tom inside the greenhouse and quickly bailed back to the house to presumably make a phone call. Tom believes that call may have been to Courtney. Tom would later say in his book, "He left so quick with a purpose, so I didn't have a chance to talk to him after that." When Tom got inside, he noticed there was a small box of drug paraphernalia laid out on the floor, along with a stool with shotgun shells, and a shotgun laid on top of a pile of towels on the floor, presumably to clean the weapon or polish it in some way. Kurt was completely out of it, Tom would say in his book. He was holding a cigarette in his hand, and it was still burning, but it was like he was falling asleep. A small bottle of Rohypnol was nearby, along with cans of soda, almost as if Kurt would drug his own soda to use the drug. He had been using Rohypnol lately, it seemed, or maybe it was just used against him. Tom explained to Kurt that he needed to speak to him about his wife Courtney Love and why he was hired, and he explained that Kurt's life may be in danger. As I said that, it's like a light turned on in his head, and he was suddenly more aware of what was going on. Like he knew his life was in danger, Tom said. It was like a trigger point of his. Tom discussed what he knew and offered to play the tapes he recorded of Courtney during their conversations. Kurt calmly gestured at Tom and said, "Come back tomorrow." Tom suggested there isn't time for tomorrow, and that they should go someplace private so they could talk. He said Kurt would be safer with Tom than he would be on his own property in the dark at 2:30 in the morning. Kurt looked over at the drugs on the floor and quietly said, "I wasn't doing that anyway," suggesting the heroin wasn't for him, but for Callie. Kurt was there to help Callie shoot up. As Kurt agreed to speak with Tom, they both leave the greenhouse and enter Tom's vehicle. Kurt was already fully dressed like he was ready to go somewhere. He didn't seem like he was in a position to stay anywhere overnight. Tom got the impression Kurt was on the move. Together they pull out of the driveway. Kurt was reluctant to go, but Tom agreed to let him smoke in the car, and he went. As Callie returned to the greenhouse to meet up with Kurt about 10 minutes later, Tom and Kurt had already left. Between April 6th and 8th of 1994, widespread rumors of Cobain's death have been flowing through the media. MTV and CNN report on Kurt Cobain's death as a drug overdose. The rumors were stated after someone called into major radio stations claiming the news to be true. Grant believes Love was behind the initial reports, trying to send the media into a frenzy. She also went public about Cobain being missing, divorce, and infidelity. Everything that was once confidential between Love and Cobain, and now Grant, was now public information being reported by the media. Courtney would tell media outlets that Kurt was suicidal and owned a shotgun, that Kurt was scared for his life and now he's in debt because he backed out of the In Utero tour. The death rumors are false, and in this timeline, on April 6th to 8th, Cobain is still alive. Chris Novoselic would comment on the death rumor stating, "I already thought I had lost Kurt once, and now I'm getting that a second time. There is no official report on Kurt Cobain right now." He would also say, "Last time I saw Kurt, he was out of his mind. Everyone was afraid for him. I thought he'd crawl into a hole and overdose on heroin. That Rome thing changed him. He wasn't the Kurt we loved. It's like he was out of his mind." Novoselic would also comment on the intervention they had for Cobain in late March. He explained, "Kurt didn't like that at all. He was pissed off at me and everyone who was there. He wanted to quit the band. He didn't want to lead Nirvana anymore. He wanted to stop making music." Dave Grohl would later comment on the situation saying, "I got tired of seeing Kurt die. You start to mentally prepare yourself to lose a friend, and Kurt was one of those people." Grohl decided it was time to take some time away from the band as he felt Nirvana was, quote unquote, basically over. He would go on to say that it was time for Kurt to clean himself up and the other members take a much needed rest from touring. Quote unquote, "We were all beat." Between April 8th and 10th of 1994, Cobain has been speaking with Tom Grant. They agreed to go to a cheap motel somewhat outside of town. Tom bought Kurt some food to eat after Kurt claimed to be starving. He said his credit cards have been declined and that he was afraid about who's after him. "He was really low. I've never seen somebody so down on themselves," Grant would write in his book. Grant explained to Kurt what Courtney told him about the credit cards and that she was the one who cut him off. They would arrive at the motel and Tom would play the tapes for Cobain. "He chain smoked for about an hour and a half while I played the tapes. We went out to get more smokes in the middle of the whole thing. I paid for them. He always insisted he had the money and would pay me when he gets his credit card sorted out." Tom paced around the room while Kurt sat and listened, smoking, very calm. Tom would say, "He kind of snickered when the whole thing about Kristen came up." Tom would say, adding like a, "Pfft, yeah, right," kind of thing. Kurt would tell Tom that he felt Courtney had something to do with the Rome incident. Quote unquote, "I wouldn't do that," Kurt would say, feeling like maybe more drugs than he wanted were slipped into his drink after he was already messed up. He had lost his memory of the incident due to the effects of the Rohypnol, but around this time he would start to recover some of that memory. "I'm not as fucked up as people think I am," Cobain added. Tom felt as if Kurt knew what was going on, but was too afraid to blame Courtney for anything. Not afraid of her, but afraid for his life in general. He expressed displeasure with the band and feeling bad about making obligations to tour and canceling. He was also in deep regret of backing out of Lollapalooza because of the schedule. And now in doing so probably cost him and his band and management a lot of money. He was afraid for his life, but also afraid of where his life would go if he kept on living. He was afraid for his daughter. He talked about his daughter a lot. He wanted her to have a good life, and he felt as if love and himself haven't provided her with that, Tom Grant explained. When the tapes included the conversation of divorce, Cobain kind of gestured to that in a way like, "Hey, not a bad idea." But it was clear that that was already on his mind, well before he heard the tapes. The first thing Kurt did back in late March was contact Rosemary Carroll to have Courtney Love's name taken out of his will. It seemed weird that a 27-year-old man would have to talk about his will so much, like it was always Courtney's idea. Tom thinks Kurt is over it. They must have fought a lot and had some really hard conversations, and Kurt just didn't want her around anymore. He wanted his daughter and didn't want to put her through what he went through as a child, which was the divorce of his parents at a young age. He was ready to just end it all, Tom would say. He felt as if there was nowhere left for him to go, and at that moment, Tom felt like he caught Cobain at just the right time, when he was at the end of his rope, dead and alone in the greenhouse, with no answers. Instead, in this timeline, Kurt is alive and discussing what would have been his death on April 5th with Tom Grant in a sleazy motel in Seattle. Nirvana would officially pull out of Lollapalooza 1994 on April 9th. The rumors that circulated of Cobain's death are still all over the media, with no real answers, with many believing he is dead. None of the Nirvana members or Courtney Love and Tom Grant have made any sort of comment by April 10th, 1994. This will conclude part 1 of If Kurt Cobain Lived, 1994. We hope you enjoyed listening, and please stay tuned for part 2 of 1994.